This is a phone from Sony's Xperia lineup, and they're changing the game when it comes to mobile photography and videography. One of the best parts of Sony's Xperia lineup are the apps that come pre-installed on the phone, and one that I want to do a deep dive on with you guys today is Sony's Video Pro app. We'll go through all of the features and settings so that you have an understanding of how the app works, how to get the types of videos you want, shooting on just a phone. So starting off, you're going to see your main control center, and this is where you're going to have access to all of the settings that you're going to need to shoot really cinematic and epic video. So one of the most important settings is obviously your lenses. So if you tap lens, you can scroll between the 16mm, the 24mm, and the 60mm lens. And this is just going to give you a lot of options so that you can shoot wide if you need to, or if you're really far away, you can punch in and use that telephoto lens. Another thing that you'll see is the autofocus versus manual focus. And this just basically gives you control if you want to be able to focus in between subjects or rack focus. Another setting that I really enjoy on the Xperia is if you go into this menu with all of these custom settings, there's a media section and you can change the title of whatever project you're working on so that the files have the name of the project. So let's say you're making like a dirt bike video. So you can say dirt bike scene, car scene, mountain biking scene, and then you can organize your files based on your own naming system. You can also decide here if you want to use internal storage or if you want to throw things on an SD card. Another key feature that you're going to see in here is frames per second. Now this feature is crucial when it comes to shooting cinematic looking video, and a lot of people think that it's really complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. Frames per second is actually how many images are being captured per second. Shutter speed is just like on a normal camera. If you were just taking a still image, if your shutter speed is low, you might see a little bit of blur, a little bit of motion, and if your shutter speed is super high, you're gonna have a very crisp looking image. There's a ratio and a rule of thumb for this, and the rule is called the 180-degree shutter rule, and this is basically just a frame of reference for you, saying that whatever your frame rate is, your shutter speed should be around double. So I'm going to play a couple of videos with our frame rate and shutter speed so you can kind of see this rule in action. With these settings, you'll have everything from 24 frames per second all the way up to 120 frames per second. Now, I will say, the Xperia stands out above the rest at 120 frames per second. And I'll play a couple of clips that we've shot at 120 frames per second so you can see the level of quality that I'm talking about here. So the next feature in this menu system is HDR and SDR. So this basically stands for high dynamic range and then standard dynamic range. And you can see that the HDR clip just has a little bit more depth of color and the color pops just a little bit more. There's also a slow motion feature, and this is basically just for quick access to slow motion. So if you don't have time to change your shutter speed and your frame rate, you can just jump in here, hit slow motion, and then you can shoot 120 frames per second slow motion footage with this quick button. So there's a section here called markers, and that's basically your frame lines and your frame guides, and you can use this for things like title safe zones, or if you're shooting a vertical video but you're shooting horizontal and you're going to crop in. There's all kinds of frame guides here, and I think that there's more guides in the Xperia phone than there is on an actual Sony Alpha camera, which is pretty awesome. So the next feature you're going to see is stabilization, and this one's pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to play a clip with stabilization, and then the same clip without stabilization. So you can see the stabilized clip on the right is much smoother, even though the cup is shaking, the background is still. So next on the menu system is going to be white balance, and you have all of the same settings that you would on an alpha camera for white balance, things like shade, cloudy, daylight, fluorescent, but if you do want to dive in and set something custom, you can do that as well. The next setting that we'll talk about is ISO. ISO is basically your camera's sensitivity to light. So on the Xperia, it goes from 64 to 1600. and I would try and stick in that 1 to 500 range with this, because it is a smaller sensor, and so it's going to be a little bit more sensitive when you push the ISO. So face IF is just like it is in an alpha camera. It's eye autofocus and face autofocus. This is great for pets, kids, animals, anything that might be moving in and out of focus repeatedly. So the color science on the new Xperia is really, really good. And something that we've been able to do is to cut between Sony alpha footage and Xperia footage without really being able to tell a difference. So here's a couple of clips so that you can compare, shot on the same time and the same day. And you can see they cut together really nicely. So some tips and tricks for getting really amazing content on the Xperia. I would highly recommend that you use a gimbal. We use a gimbal to get that epic cinematic slow motion look. It's honestly really easy to set up. You just need a phone mount and a gimbal. If you have one for your alpha camera, you can just mount your phone right to it. We've also used clamps as counterweights because the phone sometimes isn't heavy enough to balance the gimbal. Another storytelling tip that I would add is to really explore the 3 different lenses on this phone. A lot of people get stuck using just one lens, but you have all of these options and you can tell a really good story switching between a 16mm, a 24mm, and then a 60mm lens. So I'd recommend putting yourself in scenarios where you might need to use all 3 lenses, or just using all 3 as a storytelling tool. So in my opinion, the best way to really get to know a camera and a menu system is just to take it out and to play with it, to try it, to put yourself in scenarios where you push the limits of the camera and you push the limits of yourself. I would highly recommend grabbing this Xperia, taking it out and trying it, because I do think the cameras keep getting better and better. You can see what we've been able to create on it, and it looks great, and it cuts together really nicely with Sony alpha footage. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to drop a comment below if you have any questions, and we will see you guys next time.